Hey, welcome to The Why with James Hsu. Every episode, I sit down with a different guest to explore their why, what makes them do the thing that they do, what drives them, and how they think about the world. Today's episode is with Zac Hill. Zac is the Chief Operating Officer of the Office of American Possibilities. The office coordinates and launches moonshot ideas to address social challenges. Zac is mission focused, deeply involved in politics, and I'm so happy to have him as my first guest. In this conversation, we go through what it takes to make big ideas happen. Zac also offers commentary on where the world is going with regards to the major geopolitical powers. Enjoy. Who is Zac Hill?
Uh, I feel like this is a dating profile. I want to get matched to somebody.
I am the dating algorithm right now.
Well, I'll start professionally, I guess. I'm the chief operating officer at a thing called the Office of American Possibilities. What that is like a venture studio for civic moonshots. So we basically launch new early stage social and civic ventures or initiatives that are based on like a differentiated insight to like a nation scale problem. So we basically try to bring people together across divides and common purpose to solve some of our big challenges. What's cool is that I don't have to go at that alone. We co-founded this with 4 former White House directors of domestic policy, along with a number of like pretty awesome social entrepreneurs who have run stuff like the Special Olympics, who have run stuff like the U.S. Office of Science and Technology Policy. So I'm definitely the least impressive person involved, but it takes up a good chunk of my time. I guess the last thing I'll say about it is we try to pursue initiatives that, like I said, bring people together across divides, and that means counterintuitive combinations of people, it means counterintuitive combinations of disciplines, and it means coalitions that don't exist often in kind of the contemporary political discourse. We're aggressively bipartisan. We've got folks from the last 4 administrations on the team, and that means we do some stuff that you don't always see in DC, and that is sometimes pretty refreshing. Occasionally that can be a little bit frustrating, but I thought I had my dream job when I was working on Magic, and I realized that this is my actual dream job. So, been pretty lucky so far.
Just to clarify for audiences, Magic is Magic the Gathering, right? You were a professional Magic player. It's a card game, competitive card game. You commentated at the highest level. You played at the highest level. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, not magic tricks. That's a skill I've always wanted to have, but I can't pull any rabbits out of hats. Yeah, this is Magic the Gathering, a Richard Garfield trading card game.
So, what is that like just working with folks on different parts of the political divide? I mean, you mentioned this thing or this org as being bipartisan. Like, how
Yeah.
does that work in practice? Because it's I have to preface this by saying that I'm not American, I've not lived in America, but I get exposed to American politics like the rest of the world. So what does that actually mean in reality? And maybe give me some examples of perhaps projects or things that you've done or your team has done.
Yeah, for sure. So what we do is launch new initiatives, right? So some of our most prominent things, we've got Welcome.us in the refugee resettlement space. We've got a thing called Frontline Justice that's in the realm of access to justice, trying to democratize access to the justice worker. That's kind of like to the relationship between like nurses and doctors. It's like that for lawyers. There's not really a kind of analogous thing. We've got an initiative called More Perfect that basically is creating a set of sustained, basically a common set of goals for the pro-democracy space. And we've got a bunch of different initiatives like that. We've launched about 8 initiatives so far. And I guess the big takeaway I'd say about like working in the sort of civic entrepreneurship space and working in politics more broadly is that it's just not at all like what kind of like the political narrative about the U.S. or in the U.S. is. Tim Urban has an analogy he uses that has been very accurate in my experience, which is basically the version of politics we get on TV is as to reality as reality shows are to reality, right? So the vast majority of stuff that's happening is not, the most commonly animus-inducing narratives that we talk about all the time. And that actually means that, like, a lot of the folks you work with, I'd venture to say even the average person I worked with is, like, solutions-oriented, trying to make the world genuinely a better place, is doing everything they can to try and make that happen earnestly. And while definitely folks have legitimate differences of opinion, and definitely those differences of opinion are real and are material and affect people's lives, people have gotten to the business not to, pretend to be powerful, make tons of money, certainly not that. They've done it because they're trying to do what they can to make the country a little bit better in the best way they know how. I think that's honestly and without cynicism the average person working in this industry in Washington, D.C., and it's meant that it's actually an incredibly rewarding experience. You learn a lot that you didn't know when you were going in about just how hard it is to try and deploy anything at scale. Certainly anything that works effectively and tries to make people's lives a little bit better.
What is something that, now that you've had some time working in the civic, what do you call that? Civic nonprofit or civic venture space?
We like to say civic moonshots, but I think
civic moonshots. That's a good startup term. What are some things that you've learned from that maybe you didn't know at the onset?
Yeah, a ton. I think that there's little insights about how to do stuff. There's an amazing paper called Policy Entrepreneurship at the White House that I think everybody should read. But I guess at the big picture level, I think there's a few things. I think the first is the importance of momentum. I think when I got into this stuff, especially coming from a social impact lab that I used to run called Future Laboratories, I placed a big premium on having great ideas and having really smart ideas and having great impact theses that were validated by evidence and everything else. And all that's very important, but it's just not anywhere close to the most important thing. I think the most important thing if you're trying to bring a big, bold, new idea to life is that you have an idea whose time has come, right? And that means that there's a party bus that you're on that a lot of people are suddenly going to be willing to be on because, not only is it in their interest, but it actually animates their vitality. They want to pursue this thing, right? So Welcome.us, which was our hub for refugee resettlements run by an amazing woman named Nazanin Ash, the idea of being a hub to kind of liaise with our resettlement agencies and state, that idea could have been launched at any point in time. But it was the fall of Kabul and the really tragic timeline that undertook, or that was undertaken under, that catalyzed the amount of momentum that needed to really get this off the ground, right? So there's so many initiatives that require your ability to seize upon a moment to generate the appetite for change that it takes to move all of the different stakeholders in all of the different landscapes it takes to actually get something done. And that isn't the same as saying you just got to be opportunistic about everything. I just had an amazing conversation earlier with Cecilia that's been, one of America's foremost crusaders for immigration for almost 30 years. So, you definitely can put your mind to something, stick to it, pursue it, and try to make it happen. But it's a lot easier when you kind of make a window that everybody wants to kind of pile on all at once. I think the second thing that I'd say that I think really matters is that it's so important to pair an idea with the right person to bring it to life at the right stage, right? So it's in companies all the time. It's tautological, right? Obviously the leader matters, but in social impact, I'd say it's even more important because all of the things are true about being able to run a good company, be able to run a good initiative, but you've also got the relationship dimension of all of the other, civic organizations in a space, all of the other government departments that you'll need to liaise with, all of the other philanthropists that you need to liaise with, all of whom have opinions about who you are and what you're doing, whether it's legit, whether they trust you, including the most important person who's the beneficiary of what it is that you're trying to do, right? And if any one of those people don't trust what you're doing, they can detonate the entire thing, right? And so the ability to find somebody that's able to nourish all of those relationships while still being an extraordinary and inspiring leader, manager, and entrepreneur is just not very common. And that's why, as much of our process as we spend on developing ideas, we spend even more time trying to find the right leader or leaders after those ideas have been cooked, because that makes all the difference as to whether or not they succeed. So that's just two of the things, but that'll give us a good start.
How do you? That is a lot. I mean, the art of influencing
Yeah.
the right people, groups. You mentioned a bunch of things, but there's two things, which is one of which is influencing, and another part which I'm taking away, which is putting the right people in place of the teams or the initiatives to be successful, who will give you the maximum chance of success. Let's start with the first one. How do you get better at influence? Is it merely a matter of experience? Like, are there certain people that are better for this type of thing than others?
So I think that the nice thing about like working in the civic space, basically any change, I mean, whether you're organizing, whether you're pursuing policy entrepreneurship, whether it's social entrepreneurship, whether it's nonprofit work, whether it's NGO work, the thing that is going to be true about anything you're doing is that you're not going to be the first person to ever think of something, right? So there's going to be all of these different groups and these organizations that are going to organize themselves at different levels to try and pursue different dimensions of this challenge, right? Each one of them is going to have a different architecture for who they trust and why. And the currency of trust is, in my opinion, how most things are operationalized, certainly in the civic entrepreneurship space, and really I think you can make the case for in the broader political space, right? So I think influence is very synonymous in this context with the ability to earn trust, with the ability to deploy trust, and with the ability to activate trust. I think there's a different kind of influence, which is just kind of like raw reach and who's going to pay attention to you. But I think that that's very short-lived and it's very easy to disrupt. Conversely, if you're able to get people to trust you, you can build the kind of coalitions that you're able to sustain that last generations, right? Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And so I think that like the way that you operationalize that is that different groups seek out different things to decide who to assign trust to, right? For some groups, it's, have you actually been doing the work? Or are you somebody coming in from on high who doesn't know what they're doing? Have you actually rolled up your sleeves and made stuff happen? For some groups, it's, do you signify in the right way? Do you talk about things the way we talk about things? Do you frame things the way that we frame things?
So the credibility element is key, right?
The credibility element is absolutely vital, right? And the reason I'm talking about these groups and these organizations is that it's just almost always easier to activate an existing network of social capital than it is to have to build an analogous network from the ground up. I was just talking with a pretty awesome local changemaker in DC. He's an activist for making sure that folks are not discriminating against for pre-existing conditions. He was born with HIV and has had experiences with his employers discriminating against him for that, right? And very talented organizer, getting a ballot initiative to happen, smart, super capable guy. But one of the things we were talking about is he was immediately trying to figure out how to gain media traction. He was immediately trying to figure out, how do we get on social media? How do we get influencers? How do we get celebrities involved and whatever? And it's not a bad idea. But what we were talking about was whether that translates into the signatures he needs. And the answer is like, not really, right? And that's, I think, something that happens all the time where people hear influence and they're like, oh, I need to get a really well-known person to tweet what I have to say. Or like, oh, I need to get an endorsement from this celebrity or high visibility figure. And the thing is, that's incredibly transitory. Whereas like if you find a membership organization that might have, 1,000th the reach of, Charlie D'Amelio, but all of the users actually like buy into what they're saying, actively participate, get up, go to meetings, hand out flyers, host luncheons, like that's going to be the group that actually allows you to get something done, right? So I think that it's selecting the organized constituencies that you want to influence and then speaking their language of trust in a way that they're uniquely going to be receptive to, up to and including like putting your money where your mouth is and earning it. is vital to the capacity to actually influence people in the way that you need to do it to actually drive behavior.
Do you think that you're a natural influencer? Do you feel like in some ways you were born to do this, or did you have to get some bumps along the road or some lived experience to get better at what you're doing now?
Oh yeah, definitely bumps along the road, and like part of that is the point that I was making about different people influencing people in different ways, right? So like when I was playing Magic the Gathering, one of my closest teammates is Croatian. I've done a lot of work with Ukrainian folks this time, and like, you know, I've been a media personality. I've done local pod. I love talking to folks. Love retail politics. Love sitting in a room for 16 hours meeting strangers. But like, I'm a lot, right? Like, high energy, waving my hand. It's like a lot, right? And like the same strategy that is conducive to activating people, getting people excited, building trust in one context, certainly in an American context, certainly in an American Southern context, is like actively antithetical to a different group, right? I mean, working with Ukrainian folks, like, the same things that I'll be doing that'll help people say, oh, he's really engaged, or like, oh, he's really active, he's present, he's paying attention, come across often as disingenuous, self-magnifying, not humble. So the same set of strategies can produce two different results depending on what the context is. And so I think that, to directly answer your question, A, yes, you've got to develop and cultivate that skill, take some L's, figure out how it goes. But I also think, B, like, you got to be paying attention in real time to, like, what's landing and what's not. And oftentimes that means, like, delegating leadership when you're just not in a position to be able to leverage that trust, right? Like, there's going to be some spaces that you walk into where it doesn't matter, like, how nice of a person you are, how smart you are, how good you are at your job. You just have not earned the right to have an opinion yet. It's like you might not be the right spokesperson for the thing. So you can empower other folks, you can empower other organizers, and again, you're going to find yourself in a space where a lot of folks have done a lot of things, and you can try to figure out, like, how to block, tackle, and divide for different constituencies, or how to do enough work for them that you gradually get to enter into that space in that community, right? And that's hard, right? Because that means you have to have somebody that you trust in a position like that. That means you've got to be humble enough to take a step backwards, but it also means you can't be so anxious that when you take a step backwards, you're paranoid that the thing's going to fall apart, right? So I certainly there's a lot of lessons you have to learn, but even over and above that, I think you have to be paying attention to each relationship, each venue, each organization, each activity, because it's never going to be the same movie that plays out twice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Speaking of, what is your view on what is actually happening right now with Ukraine? This is a very abrupt tangent, but I'm just wondering, to use an earlier analogy you made, there's a reality show version of this conflict that we're seeing, but what is the Washington D.C. view, or what is the Zac Hill view on what is happening? Because I assume you keep closer tabs on this than most people.
I pay a lot of attention to it, and I will give you the Zac Hill. I mean, certainly there's no consensus. Certainly I'm not a member of the intelligence community. Certainly this is not my day-to-day concentration and obsession. That said, I probably am pretty familiar with it, and I'm reasonably well informed. So, bottom line, I think that there's like a few factors going on simultaneously. I definitely think that, generally speaking, the war is going better than anyone ever expected for Ukraine. The war is going generally pretty positive. I think, generally speaking, there's a lot of division within the ranks of the Russian army, certainly within the Russian polity. Obviously, the Wagner Group stuff was a huge blow to Russian unilateralism, Russian legitimacy. But Ukraine is playing its hand the way it needs to play its hand. There's kind of a perpetual relationship of Zelensky, understandably, being frustrated that he's not getting every ask he can get. The big Poland summit recently, like, showcases, there were a lot of very important concessions made for Ukraine, right? The fast tracking NATO membership, the commitment, Turkey being able to change its mind around, so all of this stuff, very, very, very good for Ukraine. The F-16s in Turkey, very, very, very good for Ukraine. But what does that translate into, right? So there's still a situation where it is very, very difficult to articulate a set of victory conditions that is even remotely within the horizon that anyone sees as realistic. And a lot of that's real and a lot of that's political. I mean, there's no way Zelensky can say, yes, I'm okay with the 2014 era occupation of the Donbass. It's just not something you can say out loud. Yet every analyst who knows anything about anything doesn't believe that there's a realistic path to eliciting those as a concession or retaking them in anything resembling a reasonable amount of time, right? So you have this classic democratic case where not only can everybody not say what they actually want and what they actually think, they have to erect channels to be able to convey the top line messaging without sacrificing political capital, and have your back channel messaging going on where you can actually operationalize stuff without suffering the political consequences.
So what do you think is the real end game? The things that maybe people are not saying, but the actual feasible end game to all this?
I mean, the feasible, there's not a foreseeable world for Putin where he takes over the whole of Ukraine. There's just no world in that. I mean, there's going to be 80-year-old grandmothers with rifles taking pot shots at people from the tops of houses for the next 50 years, right? So, you can't take the whole thing. I think the best case scenario for Putin, he cements his gains within the regions that he already had access to. He takes a couple key additional territorial areas, exacts a concession, declares that as a victory, uses that as an ability to build momentum. But even then it's hard because he already NATO wasn't a thing that anyone took seriously. Trump was arguably...
It's hard too because you can't violate your own internal propaganda machine, right? So that's an ongoing thing.
Yeah. I mean, but just in the West, right? Certainly in the U.S., there was a sense that this is an antiquated alliance, doesn't really do anything, costs a lot of money, and now it's just a 180 inverse of that, right? For Zelensky, I think you can liberate the existing held territory. I think you can frontline. You can basically say hey, this is putting an end to Moscow's aggression in the region, period. Which is certainly the case that he's been making from the beginning. That this is essentially a big domino effect case all over again, but that it actually is, and that anything short of total defeat is just going to teach Putin the lesson that he learned in Syria and the lesson he learned in Ukraine the first time, the lesson he's effectively learning in Belarus, which is that take until someone tells you no, and no one's going to ever tell you no. So the best case scenario I think for Ukraine is liberation of existing territory, join NATO, precipitate a forcible regime change within Russia, and and have none of this end in a tactical nuclear strike, which is obviously the word talking about
definitely
stuff
a big concern.
Saying that underpins everything, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is that there's not really a realistic path to any of those end games. I think that the big open question that literally no one who's not in the intelligence community has real information about is what the real level of political instability within Russia actually is. I was very much of the camp that the people that thought this would lead to a regime change for Putin or whatever were hopelessly naive. I thought the chances of that happening were sub 10%.
Slim to none, sure.
Yeah, slim to none. I think now with the Wagner Rebellion, the chances are it's certainly much more realistic to see meaningful political instability, and that's something you've got to be excited about if you're Zelensky. But all of that is just to say, I think that it's very, Ukraine's counteroffensive, of course they're going to narrativize it as we're not losing. In practice, they're not losing. It's just hard to materialize gains that are actually strategically significant in and of themselves, absent the framing of a broader and much longer term war of attrition whose ultimate goal is never going to be anything Ukraine can subsidize themselves, but rather making it more and more politically palatable to justify increasing infusions of resources from NATO that are actually capable of tipping the tide of the war. And that's the attrition game that I think Ukraine's playing right now.
Sure. It's interesting to hear this because whenever I read a headline that says Ukraine's winning the war, I seriously wonder, like, by
Right.
what metrics, by what conditions, like, how does one, obviously headlines are headlines, but it's interesting to hear your take on it, for sure.
Cool. Well, I appreciate that.
What does it mean for Washington, though? I mean, just what is the end game for Washington? I should ask this way.
So I think that there's the major geopolitical endgame writ large, and there's the micro political endgame such as it is, which is still a big game, which is this war, and then there's like the political variance that exists between Democrats, Republicans, and some parts of the Republican Party that are defying the kind of interventionist former Republican consensus, right? But like if you like zooming way out for U.S. geopolitics, obviously the big conflict is: are we existing in a unipolar world where the U.S. is the unipolar power? Are we existing in a multipolar world where you've got the U.S., you've got China, you've got India, you've got the increasing prevalence of the African continent, you've got the military power of Russia, everything else? I don't think anyone seriously believes that like U.S. monopolar hegemony will exist in perpetuity, right? So the question is, what does the nature of the more multipolar arrangement look like, and can the U.S. be best positioned on the texture of that overall map, particularly with regard to the ability to possess a reserve currency, which is of a special importance given what we saw in 2008, given what we saw last year, given what we saw in our banking crisis, everything else. So all of this, I think, has to be viewed in the context of the U.S.'s ability to do that. Again, very, very, very top line, how does the U.S. maintain that unipolar dominance? Well, there's military power, but that's a cost center that you don't have to deploy, so like that can do it, but it's not going to drive anything else downstream of that unless you're in a war or you're invading countries. There's cultural power, which is exceptionally important, but again, is arguably deeply important for like soft influence and second order influence, but isn't going to drive the gears of a whole lot of things. There's economic influence, which is going to drive a whole lot of gears, right? You've got the currency dimension, you've got the trade dimension, you've got the overall economic well-being dimension, and you've got the economic stability dimension that generally the more stable a global economic consensus, the better that is for the hegemon, right? And then finally, you've got the diplomatic dimension. And I think from those context, right, like the U.S. wants globalist orders that are predicated, not globalist in the scary sense, but just orders that involve superordinate global frameworks that are predicated upon American values or nominally American values, right? Universal human rights, so on and so forth. Protocols, Geneva, all of these consensuses, right? So many other stakeholders have many other different goals. I'm certainly not a China expert. I do enough conversation around it, but a very important distinction is the idea of territorial sovereignty, right? To take just one example. So the war in Ukraine is very good for the United States along a couple of those axes. The first is obviously the diplomatic axis. We've talked about the resurgence of NATO generally, and Europe's pivot away from the East and doubling down, with many caveats, particularly vis-a-vis Germany and China, but doubling down on the U.S. relationship, on the U.S. Atlantic normative values, on institutions like the UN. Like, no one saw that coming. That was a big deal. Intelligence sharing, military sharing, it's had the effect of reinvigorating like the U.S., Austria, Japan dipole, like all of those things, unequivocal, colossal wins for the United States. Mm-hmm. Economically, there's a couple ways it can go, right? So one way is you've got increasing economic interreliance between Russia and China, and particularly with India vis-a-vis energy, right? So that could be bad for the United States in as much as if that allows the renminbi to be a viable, even secondary non-reserve currency, that's bad for the U.S.'s economic dominance. It's good for the U.S., though, if it creates supply chains that become largely independent of these power centers like China, like Russia, that are vulnerable to alternative diplomatic or military priorities, right? So, again, very broadly speaking, Zac Hill think it's been largely good for the U.S., but I think if you aggregated the consensus of everybody, it would probably be a wash economically. And then, diplomatically, I think the biggest surprise over and above the kind of institutional dimension that I talked about earlier is how much the rest of the world hasn't been willing to take sides. I think in many ways the U.S. naively assumed, oh, you've got Russia coming in and just territorially invading a neighbor. Like, no one does that. You can't do that. This is obviously bad. Instead, what you see from Latin America and the African continent in particular is a lack of willingness to make anybody angry, right? For understandable reasons. You don't want to alienate China. You don't want to alienate Russia. Everybody's got their own bespoke interest. A lot of Central Africa has relationships with Wagner. Don't want to alienate the military. But also the trade relationships, understandably, didn't lead to this kind of uniform condemnation that I think some people in the U.S. expected, which actually had the effect of solidifying the Atlantic relationship, the U.S.-Europe relationship, even further, right? So, culturally, I think that it's been a moderate cultural touchstone, but we haven't seen a massive cultural shift. So broadly speaking, I think it was most substantial for the structure of international institutions in a way that's good for the U.S. Secondarily, I think that it was economically, it led to the creation of independent sustainability that I think was moderately good for the U.S. I think you could criticize it economically on the level of spending. I think you could criticize it economically in terms of the increasingly tight energy relationship, particularly with India, but I would say it nets out good. And I think that it fits very much into the overall U.S. framework for how it's going to maintain, if not its hegemony, its dominance in the changing world order.
Mm-hmm. On the subject of this conflict, is this a bipartisan issue in Washington? Whether it's left, right, center, or however you want to label it, do people tend to have similar views, or is it also very different across the spectrum?
So that is such a good question, and it depends on who's telling the story. You can narrativize this as a bipartisan issue. So there are large numbers of Republicans and large numbers of Democrats who are united around this issue, think it's a fight worth fighting, think it's in the U.S. best interest, think that it's damaging to Russia, think that it's damaging to China, think it's a pretty obvious bet. But you have sizable majorities on the left who think that it's a bad idea for a combination of reasons. It increases military spending.
You mean just the anti-war in general angle?
Yeah, and also the anti-war angle, but also the dimension of that angle. That's when you're spending money on this, you can't be spending money on that.
Opportunity costs.
We need to be spending a lot more opportunity costs. Exactly. We need to be spending a lot more money domestically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then you've got folks on the right that are basically saying, America first. We have gotten involved in a bunch of wars abroad that don't go particularly well. Why do we think this one's going to be any different? Why are we going to be arming this, still fairly corrupt, not particularly U.S. friendly prior to any of this state that we're going to be spending a ton of money on? Like how is this good for America? And if it's not good for America, why do we care, right? And then there's a fringe of that side that is kind of actually overtly pro-Putin, and that's a whole nother thing. But that's often overstated and is kind of a boogeyman. So it's a bipartisan issue in the sense that large majorities of both parties supporting Ukraine, but meaningful
Well, how to do it, I guess, is the question.
constituencies. Yeah, and then how to do it. There's actually a fairly big consensus around. I mean, Ukraine's very clear about what it's asking for. We know the military aid, we know the duration of it, we know the training we need, but the two sides that disagree about it vehemently oppose the war for very different reasons.
I see you've got the Ray Dalio book in the back,
Oh yeah.
The Changing World Order.
Oh yeah.
What are your views about where the U.S. is going this short term versus long term? Because for those who may not be familiar, Dalio's thesis is that inevitably all empires, I think this is true, decline at some point. So it's a matter of when, it's a matter of timing, it's a matter of how you define that very thing and the ramifications of it. So in light of this thing that we're talking about, what is your take or what is your view on that? Is it just something that that's a little bit overblown, like the rise of other superpowers right now? Like let's just define this as in the next 50 to 100 years, is there going to be a rapid sea change?
I think no question. I mean, the question to me is like what the nature of that sea change is going to be, right? So there's like, Ray has a lot of models and a lot of theses, and I think they're like netting out to be like both very good and very accurate. There's a few caveats that you have to say, like, I mean, one of the reasons that his co-CEO left Bridgewater is the accusations he was in bed with China and Chinese leaders. Certainly when you read the book, it does not take a cherry-picked reading to find a lot of like brazenly pro-China sentiment. Now, all of that is backed up with plausible sounding reasoning, and none of that necessarily affects the historical thesis. But, you know, Ray is very, very close with Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger and Ray were both instrumental to broaching a lot of the initial U.S.-China coupling going back decades. So, like, there's a lot of caveats that are important to just, like, accepting a bunch of this at face value. But I think it's also a mistake to just reject it at face value because of those interests, because I think Ray's model is very good. Anyway, all of that is to say, I think there's, like, a number of questions. So the first thing is, like, will the U.S. retain its unipolar hegemony that it garnered in the wake of the Cold War? That's like question one. Question two, I think, is like, given that at least will look somewhat different, what is the nature of the main differences? And like, how severe are they for the United States? And then the third thing is like, is the next unipolar power, the next bipolar power China? Which I think is actually a really important question, specifically because of India. And actually, if you are a big fan of George Friedman, he would argue Japan, which no one is talking about, but I don't think is stupid. So my personal opinion is you're definitely going to see a version of the U.S. that is less unipolar dominant, right? I just don't see a world in which economic development is happening, period, and population growth is happening, that the U.S. could maintain its post-World War II, post-Cold War, omnipresent greatness of all things, right? I mean, and not even for Ray's historical analysis. It's just like in a very straightforward way, you just had a world war where, like you see my Piketty book up there, like 40% of the capital in Europe was just obliterated. Right, so like in any situation where that happens, just relatively, the U.S. is in a better position. That's hopefully not going to happen again, and if it does, none of these predictions mean anything, right? So that was ditto with the fall of the Soviet Union. Like there was just a giant national security threat that suddenly became not one, and like didn't have any money. So like that, that's just going to be good for the U.S. independent of any of these models. That said, I do think there's some foundational weaknesses. I mean, the U.S., the polarization in the U.S. is a huge problem for social cohesion, and it's a huge problem for resourcing public goods, such as, very materially, education, where we're you can quibble about the ranking of tests, but just directionally, 38th in math, I think in the low 20s in science, and in the mid-teens in reading. The last time they did the PISA test, China's number one, number one, number one. Again, you can game these things. I'm not saying that that's like a perfect metric, but like directionally,
But
like
directionally, yeah, there's
right?
just some truth to that, sure.
Yeah, there's like a lot of truth to that, right? And so that matters. I think economically, the biggest issue is the U.S. national debt, right? The only reason that the U.S. national debt doesn't matter more is that we have a reserve currency. That lets you print your own money. That lets you essentially like forgive or release your own debt. It lets you do all kinds of things, right? The more that the dynamics we were talking about earlier lead to the renminbi or Bitcoin or other viable reserve or reserve-like currencies, suddenly the U.S. debt becomes an irresolvable issue, and the massive amount of it leads to an inflationary spiral that you see in all other countries that have debt denominated in a currency that's not their reserve currency. So that is just an inescapable problem relative to the U.S.'s aversion to raising taxes, and the U.S.'s aversion to stop spending money. Now, the good news is the alliances that we talked about earlier, particularly the alliances that involves us spending a lot of money on things like defense, have a vested interest in that money being well spent and continued to be spent. So that gives a lot of leverage to the U.S.'s reserve currency that I think matters a lot. But to shorthand it, I think there's a lot of institutions that are historically very good leading indicators of society's ability to maintain their dominance that are trending to be less unilaterally dominant than the U.S. has been for a while. So I think that's basically no question. I think, and this is not even saying anything like, AI, right? Which is a term that doesn't mean anything, but again, shorthanding it is clearly going to be a defining technology in the next 30 years. Clearly, the U.S. and China are way out ahead of everybody else. There's not an obvious reason why that would cease to be true anytime soon. And that's going to further drive some of these polarities, right? Because even if China is permanently in second place, which I don't think there's no reason to be confident that would be the case, that's still going to be net an equivocating force because it's going to be so powerful and the U.S. won't be materially dominant about it. I think that Europe is in a very weak position. I think that it's got like a senescent population. It doesn't particularly dominate in industry. You were asking about the next 50 years. Like Africa is going to be a huge deal, particularly Nigeria, but it's going to take some time for that to happen. I think, that growth we're seeing. I think like the main folks we're talking about are, secondarily Australia, but Australia matters more than most people give it credit for. India, China, and again Japan, which is not a mainstream opinion, but I think is worth talking about. The big thing to me in China, and this is a huge problem, is that Xi just reversed course on a lot of Deng's incredibly successful economic growth measures, right? Like in favor of like brazen party line nationalism, right? And like as an American, I'm just thrilled by this, right? Because like so many of the gains were just obliterated,
just
right?
undone, just wiped out, sure.
Massively. And there isn't the appetite for the historic, inefficient, but very effective, just like brute force investments in real estate, brute force investments in the startup sector that, again, were not efficient, but by their sheer force led to massive amounts of development. And of course that was always going to reverse course a little bit because the pace of development matters a lot depending on where your initial baseline was. But that is thrilling to me. Also, the secrecy and the crackdown is thrilling to me because it creates disincentives for the international community to want to base their OS on a Chinese currency whose true value is essentially impossible to peg, right? On institutions that might be militarized or might be mobilized toward debt coercion, which is increasingly happening, on information security that isn't particularly secure, and that can be queried at any moment in time. So like the securitization of the Chinese economy, not in the financial instrument sense, but in the security state sense, I think is probably very good for like Xi's ability to consolidate power, but I think is like pretty bad for China as a wannabe, not wannabe to diminish it, but like someone who wants to be a hegemonic power, right?
Aspiring hegemonic power very clearly is the objective, yeah.
Exactly. So, you know, all of that being said, we can't have this conversation without Taiwan, right? Like, I think Taiwan is a forcing function that is under China's control that is, like, very good for China. So, like, every military stimulation shows that the U.S. cannot garner dominance in the South China Sea militarily. I think diplomatically, there is not going to be any domestic interest in the U.S. for a prolonged, like we don't have a good record of prolonged wars of vicarious independence in Asia. You know that is not going to be an appealing domestic political sell. So like China knows that their biggest chip is something that we are not particularly in a position to protect, and they want it way more than we want to defend it, right? So that win immediately gives China wild amounts of momentum, and it's not a win that we're particularly in a great situation to stop. As with most conflicts that are framed in great power terms, that means that the real question of resolve, much like with Ukraine, is not with what the U.S. is going to do about it, but with what Taiwan's going to do about it, right? And everybody said that Ukraine was an LOL nation that couldn't defend itself against Russian might or whatever, and those assumptions were obliterated weeks into the war. China and Taiwan is not the same thing. The military capabilities, the organization, vastly different. But the world where Taiwan resists enough to become a palatable cause for the global community, that, to me, is what the variable is. And then you've got India, which we're running out of time, but the short version of that is all the Hindu nationalist stuff that I think is very worrisome for me as an American is like very good for Modi domestically. And I think like India's numbers are all amazing. Like again, Ray talks a lot about China, but like the Indian economy is massively recovering. Indian economic development is actually at a more rapid pace than Chinese economic development right now. Indian talent exports are extraordinary, amongst the best in the world.
There's some symbolic things too, as in the population is actually overtaking China's, and
yep.
Yeah.
And
that does translate down to things too, not just symbolic.
Massively, because as that population is larger and develops faster, that's a bigger economic base to build an even bigger middle class on, exactly like we saw in China. And with a much more palatable diplomatic architecture, right, being a democracy and so on and so forth. Militarily, it's like not an easy place to invade. Like, you know, you've got this giant mountain range, it's like fairly isolated, it's like actually very good, unlike China that shares like literally a border with Russia. It has the North Korea situation going on. So like there is a lot to like about India. Very attractive home for multinationals in a way that China isn't. Very crucially, English language speaking in a way that China isn't. So you know, it's a ridiculous take to say India, where dang nigh 2 billion people live, is underrated. But I think that it is a mistake to frame the global affairs as a bipolar conflict between the U.S. and China, where I think India is exceptionally relevant and is going to only be an increasing player as time progresses.
All right, Zach, to end this on a positive note,
yes.
What is it about the state of the world right now that makes you optimistic or hopeful as an American?
I love that question. I'm more I think now is the greatest time to be alive ever. I think that the analogy is something like, as you drive up a mountain, you get higher to the top, you get closer to where you want to be, but like the cliffs are steeper, the roads are windier, and you've got to give yourself a more powerful engine and a better car and a better machine to navigate it. And I think that like we're in an era where like we've got increasingly complicated problems, but we've also got a way better machine. And like when you look at the baseline of life, I mean, we're talking in a global context, right? Like the amount of global poverty that has been eradicated over the last 30 years, we've like cut global poverty like in half, right? I mean, like stunning. Like the stat that I heard, I forget where, but is actually true. Is like the baseline state of the world from like the beginning of time until the early 1990s, like the median and the mode state were like extreme poverty, right? Like less than $2 a day, right? And now that is just not the case, right? And that has happened in your lifetime and my lifetime, and it's exceptionally important to not myopically lose sight of that, right? And even within the United States, virtually everyone, even though we say that life was better 50 years ago, that's nonsense, right? There's not, mortality rates, life rates, and just, whether I want to go eat Thai food somewhere. I mean, it's an absurd thesis, right? So now I do think it's the best time to be alive, but as more stuff's going right, we've got more powerful tools. That means more stuff can go wrong, and certainly the amount of instability that we're seeing is cause for worry. Is that more cause for worry than when there was a giant Cold War and there were like multiple credible threats of intentional or accidental nuclear oblivion? I think maybe not, right? Everyone, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that but for one Soviet engineer who just refused to launch nuclear weapons when there was a false code that got sent out, we like might literally have seen World War III, right? But concretely answering the question of what actually gives me optimism, there's several things. The first and very important thing is that I think there was a perfect storm of stuff that happened in the like 2010s where we had essentially free venture capital and supercomputers in everybody's pockets that represented the most liquid form of advertising in all of human history, that conveniently gave you high resolution data about user behavior that could be used to essentially hack people's minds. And that platform innovation paired with the structural innovation of social media. Like we put ourselves in like a giant crucible of hyper effective advertising that I think led to extremely warped behavior for like a decade-long span of time, right as a bunch of core economic realities about the United States related to wealth polarization and all these things crashed up against
the perfect storm, if you will.
Crisis. It was a perfect storm. And now the ripples are receding, and a lot of stuff is moving in a positive direction. I think we naively during the 90s globalized under the assumption that like basically everybody agreed that like, a neoliberal democratic consensus was the way to run a company. Now I think that assumption looks very naive. We realize national security matters again. We realize values matter again. So, there's a domestic manufacturing apparatus that's stronger than it's been in 50 years. It's not there yet, but it's moving that way. The numbers on wealth polarization are starting to get much better. I think that, when you talk to media people and media platform people, the sort of Wild West era of social media is on the decline. We've got a regulatory architecture that's getting out ahead of AI. It's not there. It's going to be way harder. But if you compare how on top of it the regulatory regime was for the mobile phone revolution, where we were massively behind and arguably never regulated
night and day. Yeah.
the fact that we're out ahead of this on day one, the industry is calling for regulation, regulators have not stupid ideas, it just bodes well. So on a lot of the fundamentals, I think that the perfect storm has ended and the trends are going in the right direction. The second thing I'll say about why I think it's really exciting to be alive right now is that I just think we have great young global generations, right? Like Japan is aging, the US is to some degree aging, Europe is aging, but like Africa is young and it is disproportionately growing in population, disproportionately educated in the cities. I think that is going to be huge. Again, we've got an entire, again, not an entire, but like a continent level demographic boom where a globally middle class level of development is within reach in Africa and in India and more generally on the subcontinent, secondarily in Indonesia, than we've ever seen before. I mean, these are going to be billions of people that are entering their way into the global middle class in a world that is more connected in terms of opportunity than it's ever been before. And I think crucially leapfrogged many of the most toxic dimensions of like the V1 globally interconnected world internet that led to so many maladaptive incentives as we saw in the US. South America is a little bit trickier. We're seeing a lot more, while we have a higher overall level of strong democratic institution, we're seeing the momentum shift in the other way, particularly in Argentina, which is very scary. Arguably in Brazil, although we'll see. So, we'll see. But also, population is going to be smaller in Latin America than it is in Africa, and certainly than it is in India. So that's, I guess, the second thing. And the third thing is just a question of technology, knowledge, and possibility. Like, we just know more than we ever have. We have more tools than we ever have. We have more educated people than we ever have before. And that to me is laden with immense possibility. And including, AI beings that might be able to turbocharge all that even further, right? That doesn't mean I'm a naive optimist. It doesn't mean I don't see what can go wrong. I just think that, we've been in situations where a lot can go wrong before, and we've figured out how to navigate it because of human knowledge, ingenuity, social organization, and at the end of the day, a pro-social impulse that has, when we've gotten our heads out of our asses, allowed us to do a whole lot of good, right? I mean, there was a point where a plague was obliterating like a third of all urban life, and like we figured out how to not bite the dust when that happened, right? So I think that a lot of it's always it's a cliche that every generation believes it's living in the end times, particularly here in the West where eschatological apocalyptic worldviews are a lot more normative than they are in other places. And I think it's healthy to have a awareness of the kinds of things that can go wrong. But as David Foster Wallace has said, and many others have said, like cynicism and naivete are not mutually exclusive, right? Just because you're being cynical and pessimistic doesn't mean that you're not the one who's naive. It doesn't mean that you're not the one with a failure of imagination to realize how good things can be if we use the tools in front of us. And the last thing I'll say is I think we do live in a world where people view it as more imperative than ever to be part of the solution. People are motivated by purpose. People are motivated by solving the climate crisis. People are motivated by taking action within their communities and in their world, even if that action is making money and supporting their families, right? I think that things are easier to solve when you pay attention to them, and I think we've got a world full of people that are more motivated than ever before to try and solve the enormous problems that we're facing. So I'm pretty optimistic. I don't know about you, James.
I'm optimistic too. More so, especially after this conversation. It's nice to hear some of the overlaps that we have in in thinking. Zac Hill, it's a pleasure to have you on this for this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Appreciate you, James. You're the best.
Thanks for listening to The Why with James Hsu. To support the show, please leave a rating on your favorite podcasting app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any platform really. It helps spread the word and tell others that you enjoy my work. Same goes for YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and leave a comment. That helps get the word out and goes a long way. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.